Good morning, everybody, and welcome to In the Know webinar series. Today, we're talking about a hot topic. It's all about elections, and I'm joined by a well-renowned economist, Isaah, who's a chief economist and head of research at Rand Merchant Bank. Welcome, Isaah.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, Steve. Good to be with you today.
Thank you for joining us. As I want to start off, looking at this particular graphic, it's all about global GDP. What's interesting here is that South Africa contributes a mere, $0.42 trillion to global GDP. Yet, we are one of the most observed countries in the world when it came to our elections. Why has the world got so much interest in South Africa's politics?
Look, if you look from a global GDP contribution perspective, yes, it's very small. That 0.42 trillion translates to less than 0.5% contribution to global GDP. But if you look within the African continent, depending on which exchange rate you use, depending on whether Nigeria is devaluing or Egypt is devaluing, you get a bit of a change in terms of the ranking between those two or three economies. But as it stands, given the recent devaluation, South Africa is the largest economy in Africa. So that automatically gives a spotlight on any developments that take place within the South African economy. And of course, this year, with over half of the countries globally going into elections, we have a much more closer focus to large countries in regions that matter. We are one of those large countries in the African continent, which is the global provider to in terms of commodities, particularly the green commodities that we talk about in the decarbonization rate. So it is natural for the world to provide a focus on South Africa, but also in the recent past, with the court cases at the ICJ, South Africa was in the limelight. So again, this has just already, given some focus on South Africa in a global context. So these elections are no different. It is to see what happens in the largest African country, which is still quite, influential in the continent, because it sets the tone for what happens in the broader African context.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Isaah. Then just turning our attention to just the voter turnout. There was a record 27 odd million people that were registered to vote according to the IEC, and then 6 million or 16 million ballots were cast, representing 58% turnout rate. Is this a global norm, or is this relatively low compared to what people would experience in other countries, maybe in developed markets around the world?
So first, it is a global norm. Voter turnout have been reducing across many economies. Secondly, it is one of the lowest voter turnouts we have seen in the South African context. This just tells you that a significant proportion of populations in South Africa and globally are finding it difficult to participate in the political process. I mean, we can see for our case with unemployment rate of over 30%, if you look at the youth, depending on which segment of the youth you take, it's a minimum of 40% up to 75%. So that naturally gives you a sense that a significant portion of the youth is disenfranchised because they're not seeing the benefits of the economy in their daily lives. So they don't see a reason to participate in the political process. That's what we're seeing in South Africa, but it's not unique to us.
Okay, so we're just talking about, just the youth of South Africa, of our 62 odd million people, there's a huge proportion that are under the age of 35 years old, and there's huge unemployment rates of probably north of 50% amongst 18 to 39-year-old cohort. And these individuals, although low turnout at the actual polls, want their voices to be heard. And I believe they want to make a substantial impact in terms of the direction that the country is going in. What do you think drives their particular vote, Isaah?
Look, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what drives the behavior or tendencies that we see in the youth in SA and globally. But I guess economics trumps a lot of things. If people are not engaged economically, if people are not in places of work, if people are not in education, it becomes difficult for them to actually participate or at least see the benefits of participating in the political process. So they tend to be disengaged. Okay.
All right, that makes sense. Just turning our attention to the actual outcome of this election, without knowing exactly how things are going to manifest with the various coalitions. I want to turn just your attention to the Gini coefficient, having a look at the equality index. Many people were surprised in terms of the actual percentage votes that the ANC got. But if you look at just the Gini coefficient, which really looks at the proportion of income that different groups of households receive. In South Africa, you can see the richest 20% of the population holds nearly 70% of all the income, which is amongst, if not the highest in the world. So I just wanted to point to that. And then if we look at the crime statistics, we know that crime is bad within our borders, and very little has changed over the last decade. And then obviously we've got the our Eskom / load shedding debacle. The situation over the last couple of weeks has improved dramatically, yet over the last couple of years it's been woeful, to say the very least. And the graphic that's depicted over here shows you the actual amount of load shedding days that reached a peak of almost 300. If you look at towards the end of 22 and 2023, obviously putting a huge amount of pressure on local GDP and consumers at large within the country. And then having a look at just some pre-election concerns for the ANC, you could see that since 1994, barring obviously 2004, there's been a slow, I would say, downturn in terms of ANC's ability to garner support, which is not surprising given the slides that I've shown you before. So why is it, Isaah, that the markets both locally and internationally were shocked with the actual outcome of these elections in terms of the amount of votes that the ANC garnered?
Look, I think the first aspect we have to admit is almost none expected the ANC to get more than 50%. So that was a consensus view, that the ANC was going to get less than 50% for the first time in a national election, get less than majority votes.
Yeah.
Most expected the ANC to get somewhere between 45 and 50%. But if we look at historical trends, the maximum decline from general election to general election we have seen was in 2019 of about 4.7 percentage points. If you were to then use that as the basis from 2019, where the ANC had about 57.5%, if you round it out just what the number that is on the screen, 58%, that would imply that the ANC should have gotten about 53% of the vote in this year's elections. But then if you analyze the actual outcome of elections, you can actually see that the opposition parties did not grow. We had a new entrance in the political scene in December 2023, that is the MK party, which got just over 14%. And then if you take that 14%, which largely came from the ANC, then you can see that without the formation of the MK party, all those voters that voted for the MK are traditional ANC voters. So the disruptor in these elections have been the MK party. The DA did not grow as much. The EFF actually declined. You have some improvement for the IFP, but across all the opposition parties, even with the significant decline that we have seen from the ANC, opposition parties did not increase, except for the MK. So that is the surprise in these elections. None in the market has expected the MK to perform as it did. If you look at the history of breakaway parties from the ANC, they've gotten, less than 8% of the vote. You can start with COPE, you go to the EFF, they have gotten less than 8% of the vote in their first elections after breaking away from the ANC. So many expected the MK to perform similarly, but the person that is behind the MK party is a larger character in the South African politics, given that he is a former president of the country, he's the former president of the ANC, quite involved politically, but also quite critical in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, historically so, but also even now, if you look at how much support he generally gets. So that is why we have seen the MK perform significantly better than expected.
Yeah, the results from the MK party were absolutely profound, and especially, within KwaZulu-Natal. It's going to be interesting to see, how it manifests, in terms of the coalition governments going forward, what they're going to do, with their parliamentary seats in Parliament. So that for me is going to be very, very interesting. Just in terms of international markets, would this be seen as a positive, that they've taken votes away from the ANC, or is it more of a concern?
So far, if you look at how markets are trading, with the discussion of coalitions still taking place, there is, a sense that potentially the ANC is going to go into a coalition with the DA. And that supposes that we're going to see some policy continuity as far as the economic reforms, the private sector continuing to increase its participation in the economy. We'll continue to see the independence of the central bank and also being protected from political influence. And then we're going to see, much more prudent fiscal management. And again, much more overally, expectations are that we're going to continue to see, the constitution being an overarching, mechanism through which the South African economy or the country as a whole, functions. That is what the market assumes for the ANC-DA coalition is going to continue. There is a different interpretation for a different outcome if we don't see the ANC going to coalition with the DA. That is the coalition of the ANC and parties on the left. And parties on the left would imply the EFF and the MK. There is a sense that markets will potentially react negatively to that, particularly as far as it pertains to certain policies that might dent the independence of the central bank, but also, that might lead to more populist policies that cannot be sustained from a fiscal perspective. And in addition to that, there are some political parties such as the MK party that suggest that they would have to suspend the constitution. And that is one of the fears that the markets are interpreting you know, with that scenario, if that scenario were to pan out, where we are likely to see a sell-off in the rand, a sell-off in bond yields, if that is the coalition that is chosen. There are many other, you know, scenarios that could take place besides the ANC DA on the one end and the ANC EFF and MK party on the other end. There is also a government of national unity, and in addition to that, a minority government. So all these scenarios, they come with different connotations of what it means for economic policy and what it means therefore for economic growth and general progress of the country.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I think you know, markets are waiting to see how things unfold. You know, the rand obviously you know, blew out a bit with some of the, you know, early election results, but it seemed to have stabilized. And I think it's much of a wait and see, you know, stance from you know, investors globally, as well as locally. You know, just going back, I mean, you touched on some of this already in terms of, you know, the ANC and you know, only securing 39% of the National Assembly vote, and why this was, you know, not that of a surprise. And then, you know, just in terms of, you know, the best potential outcome from a market's perspective is to have a ANC, DA, and potentially an IFP coalition, you know, in terms of, you know, policy remaining pretty much the same. And I think that's really, Isaah, what you're pointing out here, is that the, you know, markets are looking for stability, and anything that unsettles, you know, stability is of a concern, and that is pretty much what the markets are looking for at this point in time. I also want to touch on something else, which is another potential outcome, is a GNU, which is a government of national unity, which has been spoken, you know, a little bit about. And maybe you can touch on it. What does it actually mean? What is a government of national unity? And whether, you know, if that is formed, you know, is the general consensus around a GNU positive or negative for the country?
Look, perhaps before I try to provide a view on the government of national unity, let's talk through the stability elements that markets are looking for in the different coalitions. I think there are three different strands of stability that are all intertwined. There is stability for policy. There is stability within the ANC itself. It's still the largest party with 40%. And then there is stability politically in the country. They are different, but they are related. If we do achieve stability from a policy perspective because of a particular coalition, that stability also has to be present within the ANC itself, because there are different camps that advocate for different policies, that also advocate for different coalition partners, which is why we have not yet had any agreement, or at least any pronouncement, on which coalition partner the ANC is going to choose. It's because there are different views within the party. And then all of these two, which is the stability of the ANC within the ANC and stability of policy, should interact such that they produce the economic progress that ensures stability for the country politically. If we do not see economic growth improves, jobs being created, neither stability from an economic policy perspective nor stability within the ANC is going to guarantee stability in the country overall. So all of these things needs to be intertwined across the board. And then coming back to your question of a government of national unity, we have had it before. The first government after 1994 was a government of national unity, where ministers across departments are appointed from many political parties, and all the political parties rally behind a particular agenda that serves the country overall, which means there is no formal coalition agreement with any individual political party. But parties agree the largest party will elect, or will forward a candidate to be elected president, and that president then elects his cabinet from the different political parties. In a way, it's also much closer to a minority government, which would have many parties in it. So they would share some elements, but they have to be an agreement as far as the main overarching agenda is for the country that all political parties support.
Could it be, Isaah, I mean, on the back of what you just said now, could it be too many cooks, spoiling the broth if we go towards, a government of national unity, where you are looking at an overarching, direction for the country, but you've got so many people, obviously within, Parliament, different opinions, different agendas, etc. How do you ensure that you pull everybody together, that has a different agenda, maybe slightly different ideologies, in the same direction?
Yeah, look, I think that goes beyond my area of expertise, but suffice to say, it's very difficult when you have, different ideological, views from the different parties. It becomes quite difficult to get a consensus, particularly on key areas where individual parties holds very strong views. That becomes quite difficult to contemplate how that happens. All you have to do is to go back about 20 years ago and try to look at the policy propositions in Parliament and how parties have voted. You can see a clear pattern where there are significant differences across the main opposition parties with the ANC, which would make it difficult to form a coalition. Perhaps that is the reason why we haven't seen one yet, where the political parties are still struggling to find each other. Hopefully, they do find each other sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. Well, look, I mean, certainly it's a new dawn for the country, in terms of what's transpired over the last 30 years. Just a couple of, final questions before we finish off here. Do foreign investors and the majority of the voter base want Cyril to remain president, just from some of the research that you and your team have done?
Look, I think from an investment perspective, there is already an economic reform agenda that started with President Ramaphosa's first administration, which so far there has been some progress, particularly on the energy front. We can see it with the absence of load shedding over the last 2 months, but there is also some progress on the logistics sector with the reduction of waiting times for ships anchored at harbor. But also, in addition, there's a reduction in security incidences on the Durban-Joburg railway line. All of those things suggest that there is some improvement, that if we were to see a continuation of the current president into the coming administration, that will bear some fruits as far as the economy is concerned. So that's looking from an investor perspective. And we do talk to many investors on an ongoing basis, locally and offshore, and they do also allude to the same. But as far as the voters are concerned, I think the election outcomes do say as much. There is no party that has an absolute majority, which means voters have decided to say all the different political parties must come together and agree on an agenda that serves us. But as it stands, none of you actually has an overarching agenda that serves us. That's why we didn't give an absolute majority to any. That would be my interpretation of the outcomes of the elections. But still, we have the ANC at 40%. It means there's still a belief by a significant proportion of the population that the policies and the implementation that comes with those policies is still supported by a significant portion of the population. It's just not a majority population.
Yeah, I mean, I would align with your thoughts on that one, Isaah. And then just in terms of, just looking at the markets, post the election, the MPC expects inflation to be around 5.1% for 2024, stabilize around 4.5% in Q2 of 25. And then, everybody's, talking about rate cuts. We looked at the US starting off the year, many, envisaged about 7 rate cuts being passed. Now we look at potentially only 2. South Africa, we thought we'd see a rate cut towards the end of this year. Now there's talk of obviously being a rate cut maybe in the second quarter of next year. With so much uncertainty around, and with GDP, growth of around 1.2% for this year and maybe increasing by, a couple of basis points to 1.4% in 2025. What is your feeling around the potential rate cuts in the next 12 months? And, you did allude to rail and things which are starting to look a little bit better for the country and obviously less load shedding. So potentially 2 questions here. The first is the rate cuts question. And the second is, how do we get GDP growth right up there to around 2.5%, so we can start creating more jobs, etc.? What is required?
So on your first question, on interest rate path, we see only 1 cut in interest rates of 25 basis points later in the year, so in November. At the beginning of the year, we had thought 75 cumulative basis points, but with the change in sentiment and expectations for the US Fed cutting cycle, that also impacted our views. If you look from an inflation perspective, it has been coming down, but not in a straight line, quite sticky on the upside, which then suggests the SARB is unlikely to be in a hurry to cut rates as long as inflation remain well above the midpoint of 4.5%. So it's just 125 basis point later in the year, with much of the cuts we had previously expected for this year pushed into 2025. So in 2025, we have about 75 basis points priced in, which we think are likely to come if inflation continues on the path that we project. And then on your second question on economic growth, I think it centers around structural economic reforms. We have been on this path since Operation Vulindlela was launched, essentially unblocking all the red tape that prevents implementation of reforms quicker, with a focus on a few key areas such as energy, logistics, water sector, the digital space, safety and security. Those are prerequisites that would be required before we can see business confidence lifting. And of course, if you look at the first quarter of this year and the second quarter of this year, confidence remained quite low. For the first quarter, at about 30%, which implies that only 30% of business respondents were satisfied with prevailing business conditions, which means the other 70% remained dissatisfied. In the second quarter, There has been some improvement by 5 percentage points to 35, which means just over a third are satisfied, implying close to 2/3 remain dissatisfied. And if businesses are dissatisfied, they don't make long-term commitments in terms of investments. So we actually need to see a continuation of the implementation of these structural reforms before we can see confidence rise, which will then be followed by an increase in the growth of investments that can create jobs in the economy.
And I suppose that would hold true, I mean, for international investors, just looking at foreigners who used to hold more than 35% of our government bonds, they now hold less than 25%. So they've been net sellers for a number of years, and they've sold north of $1 trillion, rands worth of equities over the past decade. So would that be the same for our foreign counterparts? Would they be looking for much the same before they start to reinvest into the South African economy, or have they got a slightly different agenda and slightly different needs?
Look, there are different types of foreign investors. There are those that bring foreign direct investment, which means long-term type investment that looks through the cycle, that chases economic growth. And then there are those that invest in our bonds. We have the ability to come in and come out of the market quickly. So essentially, those, the typically called hot money, they can come in and out quickly. Those take opportunities of the mispricing in markets, but they also have the ability to look at other economies that offer better risk-adjusted returns. So it really depends on which type of investor you are looking at. But generally, both offshore investors and domestic investors look for the same things. It's returns at a lower risk. If as a country we can create economic growth, that as a proxy of returns means it's going to attract both the domestic and foreign investors. If we can remove all the risks in the economy that include things like load shedding and a lot of the dysfunction in the logistics sector and security and safety issues, that can lower the risks for the economy, which means we can attract both the domestic and foreign investors alike.
Fantastic. Thank you, Isaah. And then just finally, maybe just to end off on a positive note for our viewers, just in terms of optimism, from your perspective and your team's perspective, based on the research, that you've done, what are the things, that we should be excited about within South Africa, that we can look forward to, within the South African borders over the next, let's say, 24 to 36 months? What gets you up in the morning with a smile on your face, being a South African citizen?
Look, I'm always an optimist, and I've seen the South African population is quite resilient. We have demonstrated time and again that just before things, get messy, we turn around and do the right thing. I tend to characterize the body politic in the South African context like an overweight person that never goes to gym, never eats right until they are told by the doctor that they will suffer a heart attack. At that point, they turn around and do all the right things. That was 1994, avoided a bloodshed. That was the beginning of load shedding. We were told we will have load shedding, didn't do the right investments. But when load shedding came and it started to have a significant impact on the economy, the reforms were done. The private sector is now investing in new energy generation. I think this one is also not different. We are at a critical point, turning point as far as our body politics is concerned. I do hope we'll end up with coalitions that produce the right outcomes for the country. And then, if we look at the actual outcomes of the current policy reforms, there is reason to be optimistic. Many of them are irreversible, irrespective of which coalition you are going to look at, because they provide both political and economic incentives for whichever political party comes to actually solve them. So that for me gives me optimism that we will actually eventually implement these reforms, and economic growth is going to improve, hopefully with job creation.
Fantastic. That brings us to the end, Isaah. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. The insights that you share, the knowledge that you have are just absolutely phenomenal. And I'm sure the viewers today have got much from this particular webinar. And until we have you on again, thank you for your time and your insights. And to the viewers, thank you again for tuning in and watching another one of our webinars. Until next time, thank you very much. Have a fantastic day further.